My name is Margaret, and I'm 71 years old. At my age, silence is supposed to be a blessing, a moment of rest, a break from the noise of the world. But in my house, silence isn't restful at all. It presses down on me like a heavy quilt in the middle of summer. It follows me from room to room, filling the spaces where laughter, music, and footsteps used to live. I lost my husband, Robert, 3 years ago. We had been married for more than 40 years. When he passed, it felt like a part of me was buried with him. The house we built together, the one where we raised our children and celebrated every holiday, suddenly became too big. The kitchen where I once rushed to make Sunday breakfasts, the living room where we danced clumsily to records from the 70s, all of it became still. Most mornings, I follow the same routine. I shuffle into the kitchen, put on the kettle, and take my pills for blood pressure and cholesterol before I forget. Sometimes I glance at the little pill organizer on the counter and chuckle to myself. When did my life start being measured out in tablets and doctor appointments? After tea, I water the plants in the living room. They don't complain if I forget, but I still talk to them now and then. Old habits die hard. When I dust the shelves, I pause at the family photos. There's Robert in his navy blue suit on our wedding day, grinning as if he had won the lottery. There's the kids in their Halloween costumes back in the 80s, when neighborhoods were full of trick-or-treaters and not a worry in the world. Sometimes I pick up the old photo albums or a stack of yellowing postcards we used to send when long-distance calls were too expensive. I run my fingers over the faded handwriting, his handwriting, and for a moment, it's like he's right there again. But then the quiet returns. It always does. It wasn't that I was unhappy, just that I had stopped expecting life to bring anything new. My world had shrunk down to grocery trips, doctor visits, and the occasional phone call from my daughter, who lives 3 states away. Even the neighborhood has changed. The little bakery where Robert used to buy me apple turnovers closed years ago. Families moved out, younger people moved in. They don't stop to chat on the sidewalk the way neighbors used to. Then, one chilly October morning, the heater broke. For some, that would be a nuisance, maybe even a crisis. For me, it felt almost like a blessing, something to handle, a reason to pick up the phone. I called the community center, and they gave me the number of a handyman named Luke. I expected an older man, maybe gray-haired like me with calloused hands and a gruff voice. Instead, when I opened the door, there stood a man in his early 40s. He had kind eyes, the kind that don't just look at you but really see you. He didn't say much at first, just nodded politely and got to work on the heater. I hovered nearby, unsure if I should leave him alone or try to start a conversation. Finally, I asked if he wanted coffee. He looked up, wiped his hands, and smiled. Tea would be wonderful, thank you. So I boiled the water, pulled out the old teacups Robert and I used on Sunday afternoons, and felt a strange nervousness I hadn't felt in years. When was the last time I made tea for someone else? As the kettle whistled, I noticed how alive the house suddenly felt. The sound of a stranger's footsteps, the scent of fresh tea, the faint hum of the heater starting up again. We sat at the table. At first, we spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the neighborhood. But then, almost without realizing it, I found myself telling him about Robert, about how we used to repaint the living room every spring just for a change, about how we'd spend Saturday nights listening to the Supremes or Simon and Garfunkel on vinyl, singing along even when we forgot the words. I told him about our garden, the roses that Robert swore only bloomed brighter when we argued and made up right there among the dirt. I hadn't shared those memories in so long. And Luke, he didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. He listened in a way that made me feel like the past wasn't just mine to carry anymore. His listening was like sunlight breaking through after a long, cold winter. Finally, he said softly, "I'm sorry. It sounds like you loved him deeply." I smiled through the tightness in my throat. I did, and I still do. He didn't try to comfort me with cliches. He just let the silence sit with us. Not heavy this time, but gentle, almost like a companion. When he finished fixing the heater, he checked it one last time. "This should last you through the winter," he said. Then, as he walked to the door, he added, "Thank you for the tea and for the conversation." That evening, I sat in my usual chair by the window. The silence was still there, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt lighter. Not because of Luke, not exactly, but because he reminded me that I was still here, still capable of being noticed, being heard and valued. 2 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a small folded note. "Hi, this is Luke. Just wanted to make sure the heater's still working. Also, if you ever need help with anything or just want to talk, I'd be happy to stop by." It wasn't romantic. There were no hidden meanings in his words, just pure kindness, the sort that has become too rare in this world. I stood on my porch holding that note, and before I knew it, tears rolled down my cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of relief, because for the first time in years, I felt reachable. After I read Luke's note, I tucked it into a small wooden box where I keep letters and postcards from long ago. My children tease me for still saving things like that: old birthday cards, faded photographs, ticket stubs from concerts Robert and I went to in the 70s. But to me, those little scraps of paper are proof that someone thought of me, proof that I was part of something bigger. And now, Luke's note joined that box, resting quietly among memories of a life that sometimes felt too far away. The following week, I found myself humming as I dusted the shelves. That might not sound like much, but I couldn't remember the last time I hummed anything. It was an old tune, something by Carole King, I think. Music has a way of pulling you back, doesn't it? One verse, one line, and suddenly you're 20 years old again, swaying at a kitchen with the love of your life. That afternoon, I made myself a proper lunch instead of just tea and toast. I set the table, used one of the good plates that usually just sit in the cabinet, and laughed at myself for the effort. But it felt good. It felt alive. A few days later, Luke stopped by again. Not for work, he just knocked on the door with that same gentle smile and asked, "How's the heater holding up?" I invited him in, and we sat in the living room. I hadn't had company in that room for so long that I rushed to straighten the magazines on the coffee table, embarrassed by the clutter. We talked for nearly an hour. At first about simple things, the weather, the new grocery store in town, how the neighborhood kids don't ride bikes the way ours used to. Then the conversation drifted into deeper waters. I admitted that my memory sometimes isn't what it used to be, that I keep lists for everything now: groceries, appointments, even the TV shows I want to watch. Otherwise, I forget. Luke didn't laugh or brush it off. He said, "My mom does the same thing. She says lists keep her sane." That made me smile. I showed him an old photo album, the one with the worn leather cover. We flipped through pages of family vacations, my children's awkward school pictures, snapshots of Robert and I at county fairs. I expected Luke to glance politely, but instead he studied each photo with care, asking questions, smiling at the details. For a moment, It felt like the past was alive again, not just my burden to carry, but a story someone else wanted to hear. After he left, I noticed something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just remembering the past anymore, I was sharing it, and that made all the difference. Weeks went by, and Luke came by every so often, sometimes with a small repair to do, sometimes just to drop off fresh vegetables from a local farmer's market. We'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping tea, swapping stories. He told me about growing up in a different town, about how he missed handwritten letters from his grandmother. I told him about how Robert and I used to wait for the mail every afternoon, how a postcard from a friend felt like a treasure. One evening, I found myself pulling out my old record player. It had been years since I'd used it, but I dusted it off, slid a vinyl out of its sleeve, and lowered the needle. The familiar crackle filled the room, followed by the warm sound of Simon and Garfunkel. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in so long, I felt like I was dancing with life again, even if only in my memory. That night, I thought about something my doctor once told me after one of my checkups. He said, "Margaret, staying connected to people is just as important as any pill I prescribe you." At the time, I'd nodded politely, but I didn't really believe him. Now I was beginning to understand. Connection wasn't just about family or old friends. It could come from unexpected places, even from a handyman who knocked on your door on a cold October morning. As the seasons changed, I noticed changes in myself too. I walked outside more often, even if just to wave at neighbors. I began cooking recipes I hadn't made in years, remembering the smells that used to fill my kitchen. I even started writing postcards again, simple ones, to my daughter, to an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in ages. Holding a pen, seeing the ink flow onto the page, it felt grounding in a way text messages never could. One morning, as I sat by the window with my tea, watching the world wake up, I realized something. My life hadn't ended when Robert passed. It had shifted, yes, and it would never be the same, but it hadn't ended. Luke hadn't saved me, and I wasn't looking for him to. What he did was remind me that I was still here, still capable of being seen, heard, and valued. Sometimes life doesn't change with big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it changes quietly, through handwritten notes, shared cups of tea, old songs played on dusty records. Those small things, those tender reminders, can bring color back into the grayest days. And now, when the silence settles in my house, I no longer feel crushed by it. Instead, I let it sit beside me like an old friend, knowing that at any moment the phone might ring, a note might arrive, or a knock might sound at the door. And with that, I'm reminded I'm still part of this world.